Crayola Sheep says, any advice for a person with intense chronic pain who wants to become a contributing member of society, specifically having the self-discipline to push through pain to take care of responsibilities? Well, the first thing I would say is that if you have intense chronic pain, then my heart goes out to you, because that's really awful. And so I think that you can cut yourself a break. I think the fact that you want to become or continue being a contributing member to society is a testament to your fortitude. I guess the first thing I would ask you is if your pain has been reasonably managed. You probably know this, and I'm not giving you any medical advice because I can't, but you might want to note that there are antidepressants that are quite effective as long-term pain medications, and you may already know that, but if you don't, then you should check that out, because they're not addictive, and they can be a very effective adjunct. I would also say that the literature on chronic pain tends to indicate that more activity is better than less, and that's partly because when you get engaged in something that's meaningful, let's say, and important to you, that activates the dopaminergic system, the same system that cocaine activates, and that can produce a fairly pronounced analgesic effect. So I would say everything that you can do to get yourself occupied with things that you regard as important and worthwhile is actually probably going to help you manage your pain better. It looks like inactivity is bad, generally speaking, for chronic pain. I mean, obviously that's not the case if the sort of activity that you're engaged in is of the type that will aggravate an underlying chronic physiological condition. But I would say make a plan, make a daily plan, make a weekly plan, make it, push yourself a little bit farther than you can go comfortably on a weekly basis, and see how far you can get in a year. That's because what's your choice? I mean, you're laying there suffering is not preferable to doing things and suffering, not generally. So I would say, like, more power to you for trying, but also do keep in mind that activity, meaningful activity, is a good analgesic. So I talk to people very frequently whose families have provided them with too much protection, and they know it themselves, and that means they're deprived of necessity. One of the things that you see in the United States, for example, is that the children of first-generation immigrants often do better than their children. And the reason for that is that the children of first-generation immigrants have necessity driving them. And you don't know how much you need necessity to drive you, because maybe you're not very disciplined. And if a catastrophe doesn't immediately befall you if you don't act forthrightly today, then maybe you never act forthrightly, right? Because the gap between your foolishness and the punishment is lengthened by your unearned wealth, and so you never grow up and learn, and you have to get yourself away from your dependency in order to allow necessity to drive you forward. And that's to become independent and to become mature. And I think part of what's happening in our culture is that the force that's attacking the forthright movement forward of young men in particular is afraid of the power of men, because it's confused about the distinction between power and authority and competence. Like a man who has authority and competence has power as a byproduct, but the authority and competence is everything. And people who can't understand that fail to make the distinction between power and authority and competence, and they're afraid of power, and so they destroy authority and competence. And that's a terrible thing, because we need authority and competence. What else is going to allow us to prevail in the long run? And so you get away from your country, and you get away from your kin and from your father's house, right? And you go out there and you establish yourself in the world. It's a call to adventure. That's what the first lines in the Abrahamic story is, a call to adventure. So, great, unto a land that I will show you. Well, what does that mean? One of the things that I've been struck very hard by a number of writers, Carl Jung obviously among them. I mean, he wrote things like Nietzsche that if you understand them, they just break you into pieces, And one of the things that Jung understood and the psychoanalysts understand, it's one of the most terrifying elements of psychoanalytic thinking, is very tightly allied with religious thinking, which is that you are not the master of your own house. There are spirits that dwell within you, meaning you have a will and you can exercise a certain amount of conscious control over your being, but there are all sorts of things that occur within you that seem to be beyond your capacity to control. Your dreams, for example, that's a really good example, or your impulses, for example. You might think of those as so foreign from you that they're not even, you don't even want them to be part of you. But more subtly even, how about what you're interested in, what compels you? Like, where does that come from? Exactly. Because you can't conjure it up of your own accord, you know. So if you're a student and you're taking a difficult course, you might say to yourself, well, I need to sit down and study for 3 hours. But then you sit down and that isn't what happens. Your attention goes everywhere. And you might say, well, whose attention is it then if it goes everywhere? Because you say it's your attention. It's like, well, if it's your attention, maybe you would be able to control it, but you can't. And so then you might think, well, Jen, just exactly what the hell is controlling it? And you might say, well, it's random. Well, it better not be random. I can tell you that. That happens to some degree in schizophrenia. There's an element of randomness in that. It's not random. It's driven by the action of phenomena that I think are best considered as something like subpersonalities, although even that's only a partial description. You can't make yourself interested in something. Interest manifests itself and grips you. That's a whole different thing. And so what is it that's gripping you? And how do you conceptualize that? Is that a divine power? Well, it's divine as far as you're concerned because it grips you and you can't do anything about it. And so there's a calling in you towards what you're compelled by and what you're interested in. And sometimes that might be very dark and sometimes not. But you're compelled forward by your interest. And so the idea that what moves you away from your country and your father's house and the comforts of your childhood home is something that's beyond you and that you listen to and hearken to. That's exactly right. And you can say, well, I don't want to call that God. It's like, it doesn't matter what you call it exactly. It doesn't matter to what it is, what it's called. It still is. And if you don't listen to it, that's the other thing. If you don't listen to it, and I've been a clinician and talked to enough people now, as old as I am, to know this absolutely. If you do not listen to that thing that beckons you forward, you will pay for it like you cannot possibly imagine. You'll have everything that's terrible about life in your life and nothing about it that's good. And worse, you'll know that it was your fault and that you squandered what you could have had. So, this is not only a calling forth, but a warning. Unto a land that I will show thee. And that's it, that I will show thee. And you don't want to be too concrete about this, you know. There's all sorts of new territories that you can inhabit. There's abstract and conceptual territories. If you go to university and you study biology or you study physics or any discipline, you're in a territory, right? You're in the territory that all the scholars have established. And then as you master the discipline, you move out beyond the established territory into the unknown. And that's a new land, right? Maybe it's even a land of your enemies, for that matter. But it's a new land. The frontier is always in front of you. And so, you know, when the earth was less inhabited than it is now, the frontier was the psychological frontier and the geographical frontier was the same thing, and now they've separated to some degree because there's not so much geographical frontier. But the frontier is a place that never disappears, and the land that's beyond the land that you know is always there, and it's always where you should go. And all of that's packed into these, 4 phrases. So,
it seems we are bound to repeat history, and what is old becomes new again. Why is it that we can't seem to find equilibrium within a society? Ideas begin with good intentions but lead towards the extreme. Yeah, well, the reason we can't find equilibrium is because the environment that we live in isn't in equilibrium. And so I kind of imagine it this way. It's like we're traversing the back of a giant, this is obviously a symbolic reference, of a giant serpent, and it weaves back and forth, and you don't know at any moment which way it's going to curve and turn. And so sometimes it turns to the right and sometimes it turns to the left. And what that means politically is that sometimes we have to turn to the right and sometimes we have to turn to the left. And we don't know exactly when those, we don't know exactly how to time that. And so what we all have to do is keep our eyes open and tell the truth and discuss things with each other, especially with people who have political beliefs that are different than us, so that we can ensure that we haven't tilted too far one way or the other. And that's why I'm an advocate of free speech, or one of the many reasons I'm an advocate of free speech, is because it's the continual dialogue between people of different temperamental types that keeps us oriented as close as we can to the center of the serpent's back. And so there is no permanent equilibrium. There's only the equilibrium that's produced by continual negotiation. And a democracy is a formalized negotiation. And so, and it's free speech that keeps it healthy and alive. So there's no permanent equilibrium state except death, you know, and it's always negotiation in relationships too. Like if you have an intimate relationship or a familial relationship or even a friendship, there's no final equilibrium state. You have to communicate with each other honestly all the time and keep the relationship moving to adjust the environment that the relationship is operating in. And that's how it stays alive. And in an intimate, long-term intimate relationship like a marriage, it's a continual, it takes continual effort. I mean, it's worthwhile effort in that, but you have to be conscious and awake to keep your relationship alive. And you have to be communicating all the time. Well, maybe not all the time, because you can over-communicate too, but so that's why we can't reach a state of permanent equilibrium.